Good morning, Sunday. Thank you for coming out this morning to talk about a potentially depressing topic on a Sunday. So we will talk today about the economics of climate change and our role in it. And I will talk about my role as an economist inside what is a very complex problem that fits in many ways the themes of this conference, being multidisciplinary, multidimensional, hard to get your head wrapped around the mix of both science and art in many ways in terms of making the arguments about what it is we should do to handle climate change. Now, you have to know a little bit about me. I come from Wyoming, which is in the middle of the United States. We are an energy colony for the rest of the United States. We ship out more BTUs of energy from our little state of 500,000 people to the rest of the lower 47 states than Saudi Arabia or Alaska or anywhere else. So in many ways, our state is responsible for providing all the fossil fuels, the coal, the oil, the natural gas that leads to the United States being one of the largest emitters of carbon. And so my role is not to be a spokesperson for anybody. My role is to be a spokesperson as an economist for understanding the trade-offs we face between what it is we want, what it is we need, and what it is we can have in the relationship to what we want today and what we want the future to look like. So Wyoming is a very conservative place. It's a very Republican type place. I happen to be an independent. And so I float in the middle of everybody, and typically I am unloved by everyone because I'm not there to represent anybody other than to gather as much information as I can, process it through a particular lens, which is the lens of economics, and then give it back to policymakers and decision makers who ultimately have to decide. It's not that I'm afraid to make decisions. I have been an elected public official for 10 years. I served on the school board dealing with irate parents. And so you learn how to be a politician, but that's not my job. Here, my job is to think about what economics is and what it can provide to help with a very complex question of, how do we think about the future, what the future is going to look like? My specialty is environmental economics. I think about biodiversity, pollution. I think about all the things where the market goes wrong and how we can fix it and how sometimes some of the fixes end up being worse than the problem itself. But let's first start by defining what economics is. Economics is not finance, it's not business, it's not commerce. Economics is more about applied philosophy, if you want to think about it that way. We talk about trying to maximize or trying to improve well-being. We're not always talking about wealth, even though wealth is a big part of well-being. So I spend most of my time thinking about market failure, when the market does not provide us the things we want the way we want them. In other words, we just don't have the prices right. And so I spend a lot of my time thinking about how to get prices right in a market system so that we account for environmental goods. So we account for what we love in terms of nature. So I live in a town of 100 people. It's about 2,700 meters high. We have a national forest of, I think it's 300,000 hectares behind my house. So this is what I do. This is what I love. But at the same time, we like to eat. We like to have shelter. We like our kids to have the best opportunities as possibly can. And so finding that balance is part of what we do. For climate change, we describe it as a global public good because a molecule of carbon released here in Valparaiso is going to have the same impact as one that's released in Mongolia or that's released in Wyoming, right? So we got to think about this as a global public good. It's a giant quilt that surrounds the earth. I think about it in that sense, in that we all gain private benefits, and what we end up doing is socializing the cost by passing the buck, either to future generations or to those most affected by a change in climate, typically those who are on subsistence agriculture, typically the poorest in the globe. And so by passing the buck, I mean we benefit, they suffer the cost. It's also, we can think of this as the world's biggest coordination game. Now, a coordination game technically is where we all say, you know, when we're done, let's go have lunch, but I didn't tell you where I'm going to have lunch. We all have to think about, oh, where should we all have lunch at the same time, given he didn't tell us anything. Then you've got to start thinking about what I'm thinking about, and I have to think about what you're thinking about what I'm thinking about. And then you have to think that you know what I know, that I know, that you know, that I know, that you know. And then we can coordinate. So if you know what I know, that you know, that I know, that you know, that I know, then going to Paris at the end of the month and coordinating climate change should be very easy, right? We only have 200 some countries, we only have 7 billion some people, and all we have to do is know that you know that I know that you know that I know. And we have a way to actually come up with a treaty that would work. This global coordination game ideas came about, the theory of it, a lot of it came about during the Cold War when the US and Western Europe were dealing with and thinking about, the Soviet Union was dealing with us in terms of trying to prevent mutually assured destruction due to nuclear war, right? So the same idea is what we're talking about here in terms of climate change and trying to figure out how to organize our thinking in terms of self-enforcing agreements. Because every time we come up with a treaty, whatever it happens to be, we don't have a global police force, and it has to be self-enforcing. Climate change is no different. We did it with the ozone layer, but that was because we had a substitute. We had something that would work other than chlorofluorocarbons. And right now, finding a substitute for fossil fuels remains a challenge. Not because we don't have solar, not because we don't have nuclear, not because we don't have other options, but we're talking about the price, relative prices of these different energy sources. So, from my perspective, I'm a climate agnostic in the sense that I take the natural sciences, I do my best to understand the natural sciences and the impacts, but I am not a natural scientist. I don't spend my time thinking about climatology. I have to take it from their perspective, and I have to understand what it means so I can process that information and give it to policymakers. What I do is advocate efficiency. This is what economists do, is to the idea that, yes, we have to figure out a policy, but let's figure out how to do it cost effectively so that we're not wasting resources, even if it's a good cause. The reason is there's lots of good causes. We want to spend money on education, we want to spend money on healthcare, we want to spend money on improving roads, we want to spend money on lots of things today at the same time as dealing with climate change off into the future. And so all we're asking is that to find policies or think about policies that can provide more environmental protection at less cost, given we have other things we want to do with our money. And usually, after spending I spent a year in the White House as their environmental guy under the Clinton administration. And I spent several years in Wyoming working. Wyoming, they have an interesting law. The people who set environmental policy in the state of Wyoming are the people. The governor appoints a citizens board that actually passes environmental policy in the state. And so I got to sit on that and actually make decisions. And what I realized is making actual decisions and all that, as much as I want to provide more for less, sometimes costs are regrettable, but by no means decisive. Sometimes you just have to do things. What the hardest part of all this is trying to understand the costs and benefits. And more intellectual energy has been spent in the last 50 years trying to understand the nature of costs and benefits when we're thinking about non-market commodities, non-market goods. What do I mean by that? I mean health, environmental issues, biodiversity, ecosystem services, all the different forms of environment that we typically take for granted because it's just there. And so actually putting dollar values on it, it's not because I want to buy and sell nature. I'm not really interested in buying and selling nature. I'm trying to get nature on the same foot as Wall Street. I'm trying to get nature on the same ground as market choices which are being made as we sit here. And why do I want to do that? I want to be able to make comparisons. I want to be able to make trade-offs. I want to be able to say, no, this is too costly. Even though we don't have it reflected in the price, let me show you how costly it is to get rid of a mangrove when there's a tsunami coming. Let me show you how costly it is to get rid of different species when they're all connected in a web of life. Let me show you how costly it truly is, the hidden costs behind these decisions we take for granted. And that's part of the job as an environmental economist, is to understand all the different physical sciences, all the different natural sciences, and actually essentially hold up a cost associated with ignoring those impacts and what they do for all of us. About 10 years ago, there was an estimate that the value of nature to the world was $35 trillion. And it was published in Nature, in a very famous paper. And for economists, we said, well, that is a serious underestimate of infinity. Right? Because we have not found an alternative planet. There is no B planet. So 35 trillion is not the number. Infinity is the number. But we can't argue infinity because my infinity is not twice as big as yours, and yours is not 3 times as big as me. So we have to figure out numbers in between that make sense. And so the way I think about this problem is planet insurance. There's a risk. The risk is real. And how much are we willing to take a chance to allow global temperatures to go up 3 degrees Celsius, which we haven't seen in a long time, or to increase to 4 to 5 degrees Celsius? How big of a chance are we willing to risk without putting money aside or without investing for this potential, I don't even want to call it a rainy day. It could be a dry day. It could be a colder day. It could be a warmer day, right? It's climate change. It's not just associated with warming temperatures. It's associated with the impact based on where you live. So this is my perspective as an environmental economist. Most economists spend their time organizing their world and organizing worldview based on markets. That's just what we do. It's our perspective. We think of markets not as a place to buy things, but as the greatest collector of information ever discovered. Because all of our desires are in that supply and demand, and that price reflects the laws of nature, the laws of humanity, and the supplies and demand. So that's the philosophical part of the market. We see it as a way to extract information in a decentralized way, and we love it, okay? But as environmental economists, we spend our time looking at, there's just no market. There's no market for clean air. There's no market for clean water. Even though Santiago, back in 1992, developed at least the prototype for one of the first air pollution markets in which you could buy and sell pollution back in the early 90s. We use it as a case study, as a way to essentially fit in a market where one did not exist before. But But then you spend a lot of the time with a lot of the folks who are here where markets are not their main organizing principle. They look at the world a very different way. They do not look at it as markets being a great thing, markets being a good thing. They don't look at markets the same way we do. And so I spend my time in that middle trying to understand everybody's point of view, bringing it together, and then running it through my own little filter and trying to interpret how to think about climate change. So the economic challenges, that this is over a long time horizon. And the further we get out, the less we know. The less we know about GDP, the less we know about future technologies, the less we know about carbon intensity. The further we get out, the link between emissions and damages, the climate variability gets enormous. And we then have to start thinking about what is the sensitivity, how much damage can we expect at different regions of the climate, and can we adapt to lower these damages, right? So that's the generic economic challenge of trying to understand how we're going to fit our story into climate change. The general economic goals, and if you go back in the history of economics, their general goal is how to overcome poverty, right? That's the big goal. The specific goal we have for climate change is how to reduce the risks posed by climate change cost effectively. Now, if we narrow down the problem to that, then the question becomes, okay, if that's the goal for climate change economics, it's a very narrow goal given the broader objective of trying to overcome poverty. Because now we can do lots of different ways to address climate change in terms of transferring capital from high carbon intensive capital to low carbon intensive capital. If we can transform economies, the US economy, the Chinese economy, the Chilean economy to use more low carbon technologies, right? That may or may not have anything to do with poverty today. But what's happened in the climate change literature, or in the climate change policy discussions, has been that climate change has evolved into a bigger perspective. It's evolved into an ethical question about the rich nations who have gotten rich using fossil fuels, asking poorer nations not to use fossil fuels to get rich themselves. And it's also emerged into issues of inequality, wealth inequality. It's emerged into issues of gender inequality. And over the years, the Conference of Parties, right, so they'll meet in Paris at the end of the month, but over the years, the Conference of Parties, which started off as a focus on climate change and environmental improvements, has now become much broader to talk about bigger social concerns. And so in some ways, climate change policy has done the job of this thinking about overcoming poverty, but at the same time, it's become more complex because now you have a whole issue of topics that you're trying to solve using one particular policy tool, climate change. And so the discussions that will go on in Paris will be wide-ranging. It won't just be about transforming technical capital with technological change. It'll be about who gets what and when. It'll be about who actually benefits and who pays the price of making this transformation to a low-carbon future. And that part of it moves the economists sort of out of the way because we don't have any expertise on changing hearts, because that's essentially what we're talking about here, right? So for climate policy to change, one way to do it is to change your heart, to get you to think about things a different way, to get you to ride your bike instead of your car, to get you to walk instead of taking a bus, to get you to transform yourself and your carbon footprint into something that's smaller. Well, economists aren't great at that by preaching to you about doing that, right? That's not our job, is to change your heart. If that was my job, I should have become a priest, right? Because, we've been trying to change hearts for a long time on the planet in different ways. What I do, and what I'll argue, is that my job is to change prices. I want to make fossil fuels more expensive. And the only hearts I want to change is to convince you to increase the price of fossil fuels. Okay? If I change your heart that way, then I've done my job. But first I want to change prices. Because as an economist, the whole idea is that if I can change prices to reflect those hidden costs and the true damages, you'll make your own choices. And you'll make your own choices that will hopefully move everybody in the right direction, which in this case is reducing the risk cost effectively. But I can't change your heart. Not me personally, not economics. Right? That's a bigger goal. That's what this conference is about. That's what the movie makers are about. That's why we have artists attempting to change how we change our perspective. You put me in power, I'll just change price. That's it. That'll get out of the way. I won't judge you. I won't make a statement about what you do. I'll just change prices to reflect the true costs and benefits as best as I can. And I'll let you make up your own mind. And that's the perspective I take. So let's take a step back and look at the Kyoto Protocol. And so the year I was in the White House was 1997, and this was my job was to look at the economics of the Kyoto Protocol. And that perspective was a very top-down perspective in which they took a narrow slice through the developed countries and tried to induce deep cuts in emissions, given the current business as usual path. And the whole debate inside the White House at the time, whether it should be narrow and deep or it should be broad and shallow. And the big argument was, no, we need to show leadership by making the developed countries agree and make big cuts, and then everyone else will sign on. China, India, all the emerging economies, Brazil, Russia, versus the view that we need to get everybody locked in. And small changes, and then we can turn up the heat. Right? So it's like, get everyone in. My position was the everyone in position. Obviously, I lost. Okay. But that's okay. Well, I don't know if it's okay. I'm not bitter about this. Right? It was the idea that we need everyone involved. The benefit side, the biggest one is this notion of an avoided catastrophe. That is what gets people's attention the most. The idea of slow changes, we can handle those perhaps. We can adapt, we can change, we can make minute changes. It's when we're talking about avoiding a catastrophe, a tipping point. It's when we pass some threshold that we can't come back from. That's the thing that should stick in your brain, because what humans typically do is that we think about the probability of an event, and we think about the outcome of an event. What's the chance it could happen, and how bad could it be? And what economists want you to do is think about them at the same time. But what people do is disconnect them, and they focus on the one that scares them or makes them the most happiest. So when you have a low probability of winning the lottery, people still buy a lottery ticket even though the expected return is negative, right? Because why? Well, it could be me. Well, it's really just a tax on the mathematically challenged, because it's a negative return. But people separate this up. So when you're dealing with climate change, what gets politicians and gets decision makers' interest and gets them to pay attention to a certain extent is when they separate out the probability of a low probability, high severity event, and it gets action. My boss at the time was Janet Yellen, and Dr. Yellen is now the chair of the Federal Reserve. And what got her attention was when I explained that the Gulf Stream might shift. And I said, it's a low probability, but she didn't hear that anymore. In her mind now, this was an issue. And essentially, that's what a lot of climate change is about. Trying to understand how we're going to avoid a catastrophe and what the probability is that we're headed there. That's the big driver on a lot of the climate change issues for most of the developed countries. Now, if you're a small island in the Pacific, you have other issues, right? But if you are a major economy, this is what you're facing. The Stern report came out in 2000, and if you know Sir Nicholas Stern, he is a very three-piece economist from London, very serious, very conservative. And when Sir Nicholas Stern comes out and says the world GDP could drop 20%, people listen. If I were to say it, you know, maybe I don't look so serious, right? When he says it, people took notice. And when you're talking about a 20% drop in the world's gross domestic product, the world's economy, you're talking about making the Depression look like nothing. The Great Recession of 2008 was just a blip. A drop in 20% of world GDP is going from $60 trillion down to 40. You know, I mean, this is huge. And there's a small probability, but the consequences are mind-boggling right now. That got people's attention. It got Sir Nicholas Stern's attention, who had never worked on climate change before. And now, that's what he does. Now he goes around the world talking about the economics of climate change. On the cost side, to do this cost effectively, there are three ways to think about it. Do we allow for flexible incentive systems? That just means, will you let me put a carbon tax on your fossil fuel use, right? Or will you put a bunch of bottlenecks in my way as an economist to increase the price of your fossil fuel use? Will you let me set up a cap and trade system so that we can actually buy and sell pollution? I was looking through and I found there is a carbon market in Santiago. I don't know how well it's working. The one in the US fell apart completely. We had one, disappeared. There's a carbon market in Europe. The price is very low because we don't want to put any binding constraints on industry yet, right? Not until we can ratchet up the system. So there are markets. There are many countries with carbon taxes. California has a carbon tax. Sweden and Norway, of course, have carbon taxes. Wyoming, we don't have a carbon tax, we have a carbon subsidy. And we're actually trying, or the governor's strategy is to send $1 billion to Oregon and Washington so they can build deep water ports so we can ship our coal to the coast and then sell it to China. Okay? Makes me nervous. I don't know if it makes you nervous, because we have enough coal in Wyoming to run the US economy for the next 300 years. So we have a lot of coal. That's a lot of carbon. And that's our policy right now as a state, is to, okay, we can't burn it in the US, we'll sell it to the Chinese. The other part of cost is engaging the entire world to participate. And I think that's the notion in Paris now, is that rather than narrow and deep, we are now going broad and shallow. And I think that's what's going to happen in Paris in a couple weeks. The next part is adopting new technologies without a price change. This sounds kind of boring, but in all these models that you hear reports about, embedded in it, way deep embedded, is this wonky technical term called the Autonomous Energy Efficiency Index. And I can guarantee that this model will have high costs or low costs based on what I think you will do to buy low carbon technologies without me changing prices on you. So I'm very hopeful that you guys are going to park your car tomorrow and get a bicycle. My index is going to be high and it's going to be very cheap. If I'm skeptical, then this transformation is about 0.5% per year. That's what we've seen historically from people giving up one type of automobile to go to an electric car. So how fast you think people are going to do the right thing for the right reason drives a lot of these estimates that you will see out there. And most economists are pretty pessimistic. We just don't think you're going to do the right thing for the right reason at the right time. What we think you should do is face the right prices. You'll notice the theme here, right? So who pays? Well, we all pay, based on trying to get the prices right, rather than waiting for the wrong price to send the wrong signal. What happened next? Cancun was sort of the next big issue where the world set a target of trying to keep things below an increase of 2 degrees Celsius, global average warming. And how to do that? Okay, well, this comes from a report released a few years ago, or actually last year. 50-50 chance if we can get below 35 gigatons in 15 years, below 20 by 2050, and if we can get emissions down to 0 by the end of the century. That is a serious path. 0 emissions by the end of the century to have a 50-50 chance of hitting this target of 2 degrees centigrade. I'm trying to imagine the world 100 years from now, or the world 85 years from now. I mean, if I imagine the world 100 years ago and thought of the technologies we had then and projected 100 years to today, I would think that, when we stepped outside, we'd still be, shoveling manure off the streets because there'd be so many horses hauling around so many people. I wouldn't have envisioned all the different modes of transportation, all the different modes of moving resources. So 100 years from now, maybe this is doable. If you're a technology optimist, you would believe it is. You would believe that this is possible to get to a 0 emissions level by the end of the century. So what does this path require? 0 emissions from electricity mid-century, 0 total emissions by mid-century, negative in some of the major industrial sectors, and we're talking about leaving more than half of the hydrocarbons in the earth that we currently know about. It's a huge transformation. There's one estimate that I've seen that economists have come up with, is that if technology transforms at the same rate over the next 100 years as it has over the past 100 years, we will leave 90% of the world's coal in the ground. As long as our technology, as long as we can keep outsmarting ourselves as we have the past 100 years, we can leave 90% of the world's coal in the ground. I'd like to see it. Okay, so here's a picture of that same issue. Here's our 2 degrees down here. And you can see the path that would take us to 2 degrees versus a business as usual path versus a less aggressive path that takes us more to like 3 degrees or so, 2.5 degrees. This is the new climate economy, that report that came out a little while ago. So you can see this is a pretty aggressive strategy. And it's going to require lots of different changes in how everyone does everything. And it goes back to this comment from the Chinese diplomat back in Kyoto, which is, you guys, being the US or Western Europe, are talking about reducing luxury emissions, and you're asking us to reduce survival emissions. How fair is that? Well, part of it is whether or not technologies can leapfrog over old technologies. Whether new technologies can just jump over the fossil fuel that got us rich over the last 150 years, whether or not we can invent things that'll just bypass that, like cellular phones in Africa. Right? We were able to bypass a lot of landlines just by going cellular. Now, can we do the same thing in terms of a transformation in the world's developing economies with 1 billion people living on less than $2 a day? Are we going to be able to transform and leapfrog over the energy that's needed for them to achieve a certain level of prosperity that they desire? It's a huge, huge question. If you can do it, great. If we can implement these new technologies and bypass the old, and we can leapfrog over them, our job of trying to hit this target is much easier. Much, much easier. But that's an open question. There is two economic views, not surprisingly. Economists disagree on everything. But there are two economic views about how to do this. There would be a deliberate economics and an urgent economics. The deliberate economics is we still have time. The urgent is, what are we waiting for? We have no time left. So the deliberate economics and policy is that our goal here is to slow the accumulation of greenhouse gases. And we're not talking, notice we're not saying anything about alleviating poverty here. It's a very narrow perspective of slowing our accumulation of emissions in the atmosphere. And adaptation is the key to this. Changing how we do things, building more seawalls, changing our fleet of transportation, changing how we use energy. But in the end, the idea is that we still have time to make this transformation of capital into a low carbon capital, and things like the Kyoto Protocol are a good start to get us to Paris, which will then be the next step, which will lead us to the next conference, which will then lead us to the next conference, but we still have time to work through all this near 200 countries and 7+ billion people. We can all coordinate eventually, because we're all going to sit and talk and we're all going to learn. And eventually, we've got time to do this. And the reason is, why would economists think about this and portray it this way? It's because this worldview is not worried about the tipping points the same way as the urgent view is. The urgent view is, what are we waiting for now? Because these tipping points are real. And ignoring the tipping points is potentially the biggest disaster we could ever imagine. Right? So this, like I said, this is a depressing topic on a Sunday. And the urgent part of economics brings out the most dismal part of the dismal science, which is to talk about technology lock-in. We're not going to be able to leapfrog over and come up with new technologies. We're going to have to go through the same development phase that the developed world went through. The developing countries are going to go follow that same phase. The tipping points are real. We're going to move into a cycle in which the Gulf Stream shifts. We're going to move into a cycle where the web of life unravels. And this isn't necessarily just doomsday stuff. This is a real possibility. And that what we need then is sound economics, which I've tried to give you. Change the prices. That's pretty sound economics. Transparent ethics. I certainly don't have a monopoly on transparent ethics. Right? Now we've moved out of my realm. I mean, I have an opinion, but it's no more or less valid than any of yours about what the ethical thing to do is. And I have an opinion as an economist, I have an opinion as me, Jason, right? Which I'm not telling you right now. Right? I'm talking to you as me, the economist. And so, transparent ethics. So what's going to happen in Paris then, starting in a little while? The big thing is going to be pledge and review. This is the term, this is the buzz terminology. where let's say we're the 200 countries. I get each and every one of you to make a pledge as to what you're going to do. And then we'd set up a review process. It's not necessarily a binding agreement, but I try to get a pledge from all of you that you would have a non-zero reduction in emissions. Right? I try to get each and every one of you to say something, yes, I'll cut by X by this date. But I want to get it from everybody. I don't want to leave you guys off in the back of the room because you're in the back of the room. Right? I want to have you guys sign on and make a pledge. But this is very different than Kyoto, which was a binding agreement. Right? And why did the pledge and review come about? Well, when Kyoto came and it was signed by President Clinton, it was not ratified by the US Senate. And the US Senate voted 97-0. They would never ratify any treaty that did not include India and China and Indonesia and all the big population centers. This was Democrats, this was Republicans, conservatives, liberals. The entire US Senate said, no thank you. Right? Not necessarily because it was a binding agreement, but it did include all the major players over the next century in terms of the world's biggest potential economies. And so you can point fingers inside the US about who's responsible, but ultimately it was everybody. Not the Republicans, not the arch conservatives, but the Democrats just as well. So now we've come up with pledge and review, which is we're going to make a pledge and then, we're going to review it. Okay? And this intended nationally determined contribution. So this is your pledge to me as to what you intend to do. It doesn't have a lot of teeth, but it's better than having no teeth. Common commitment, and then a choice on incentives. So if you're going to do this, I'm going to give you a choice on how to do this. Are you going to set up quantity constraints, a cap and trade system, a tradable permit system, or are you going to set a carbon tax? Notice I didn't give you a choice of doing nothing. Right? I've given you a choice of changing prices. Just how you want to change prices is up to you, but you've got to change prices. And so the commitment then is this global common price commitment that we will price carbon at X dollars per ton if and only if everyone else does so. Okay, so I'm going to get you to commit, pledge to a reductions level, and then I'm going to try to extract from you a price that you're willing to put onto carbon. And the idea is bring those hidden costs out in public. And if you want to put $1 per ton, that sends a big signal as to how committed you are. If you want to set $100 per ton of carbon, that sends a different signal as to how committed you are. But hopefully it's not going to be zero, right? Which obviously signals you want to get out of the room as quickly as possible. Put your head in the sand. So we're asking you to do two things. Here's my target, here's the number I'm going to put in there for that X. That's my pledge. And now let's review how well I do in this acts, in this global coordination game. I talked about me knowing that you know that I know that you know. This acts as the focal point to try to pull you together. This also implies revenue recycling. Most environmental taxes over the years have been used to raise revenue, not necessarily change behavior. The question then is, what are you going to do with the money that you raise? You're going to reinvest it in environmental goods, you're going to invest it in education, that's up to you. This green price fund is the idea that the developed economies, some portion of the money they raise through these taxes can be sent up to subsidize developing economies. Subsidies to try to get them to leapfrog over that old technology. This last one, or not the last one, but geoengineering is the big elephant in the room. besides nuclear power, which we don't, you know, like you say, I mean, that was my first earthquake too. I understand why there's no nuclear power here, right? But nuclear power is like the undiscussed option. Or geoengineering, where we're shooting particulate matter up in the atmosphere so when the sun rays come down, they reflect back higher up so we don't get as warm. So now we're talking about shooting particulate matter up into the atmosphere as a way to, I see a lot of shaking heads. You're going to hear a lot about this over the next 5 years. You're going to hear a lot about genetic, because not only do I not have to change your heart, I don't even have to change your price. I'll just let you do whatever you want to do. We'll just shoot particulate matter in the atmosphere. We're okay. You don't look convinced. I'm nervous if that's the solution. Right? I mean, this is, but you're not going to avoid this discussion. This discussion is going to happen. It's going to start happening in more and more right now. There's more and more things being written about it. There's more and more books being written about it. There's more and more popular magazine stories about it. It's mind-boggling. It really is. So, what will happen in Paris from the US perspective? From an international take on it, we're going to make our pledges. We made our pledge with China, the 2 biggest emitters of carbon, as to our reductions. We'll go into a little of this naming and shaming kind of thing. You know, that only works so well, right? I mean, you can only jawbone so much before people just block it out. Domestically, what's very interesting, President Obama has another year. Both of our Senate and House of Representatives are controlled by the Republicans. And so their main strategy right now is all executive branch actions. Nothing that requires any ratification by the Senate. Nothing that requires any positive votes by the House of Representatives, because President Obama is not going to get them. I mean, he burned a lot of his capital, no pun intended, with his health care 4 years ago. And now climate change, what he's doing there is all executive branch administration policies, such as turning down the Keystone pipeline that would come from the Canadian tar sands into the United States. That was an executive action. The clean air, the new policy on cleaning up coal-fired electric generators is an executive action. So if all of our policy from the US perspective, being the world's biggest emitter and economy, is to avoid Senate ratification, then who gets elected in a year is going to really matter. So we have a presidential race that is now started. We have Democrats, we have Republicans, we have different people lining up, and this is their view on climate change. So, Secretary Clinton, is climate change real? Yes. Is it man-made? Yes. Do we need to take action? Yes. Does she have a proposal? Yes. Bernie Sanders? Yes, across the board. Go to the bottom, Donald Trump. No, 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 no. Ben Carson is right there, 4th one down. No, 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 no. Those are the 2 guys currently leading the polls on the Republican side in the US. So if our whole strategy in Paris is to rely on executive action, who gets elected a year from now determines a lot as to what's going to happen from our perspective. I'm sure this is true for, your next elections as well. Maybe not to the same polarization, because this is well, green and red. You can see what's what. And then, well, Ted Cruz is in blue because I can't figure out what he's talking about. Nothing against Ted, but it's, I didn't know. Yes, no. Please. Okay, so what do economists have to say about that? Well, this is your transparent ethics right here. Right? Secretary Clinton, she'll raise prices. Bernie Sanders, we know he'll raise prices. Everybody else, no. They'll they won't even bother to change hearts. To summarize what we've talked about, what climate economics really is about is a transfer of wealth from us, today's rich, or fairly rich, moderately rich, to tomorrow's most vulnerable. The more aggressive we get in climate change now, it's a transfer of wealth from us to the future, who depends most on climate. And if you're willing to make that sacrifice, right, if you're willing to make that change to alleviate suffering sometime off into the future, well, that's your ethics. That's your choice. My choice is to change prices to at least reflect that notion, what you want to do. This is the cold-hearted part of economics. Do the winners win more than the losers lose? If we're going to judge success of a policy, do the winners win more than the losers lose? And it's easy for me to say as an economist and not a politician, because I don't have to look at voters and I don't have to go to funerals. Right? But as an economist, I can say, okay, we made the pie bigger, but some people lost some part of the pie and they're not as happy as they were. Transitions are just the way it goes. You don't win a lot of votes that way unless you're already elected, as, say, Margaret Thatcher did when she shut down the coal mines in Great Britain. Right? Or when in Germany they did the same thing, shutting down coal mines. And it was very hard to remain popular during these transition periods. But there's going to be some huge transitions in which you will not be popular, whoever is making them. Hope people will do the right thing at the right time. Again, I'd rather think that the right thing is to get the right price. But that's the economist to me speaking. Right? So who pays? Well, we all do. Ideally, we all do. The question is when? Postpone it. Pay me now, pay me later. You're going to pay? And who are you going to pay? Or are you going to pass, as we would say in English, I don't know how you would say it in Spanish, are we going to pass the tab? Right? Or just pass it along. Just move it out to somebody else for the future. Let them pick it up. Because over history, they've always, every future generation has always been richer than the one before. So we'll just pass it on to the folks who will be richer in the future. That's one way to look at it. Or the other way to look at it is, well, there are hidden costs. Let's make them visible. Let's get the prices right. And let's make the transformation we need. Thank you very much.